The rain came down so hard that night in Bannack, Montana, that it felt like God himself was trying to drown the earth. And Penelope Owens stood at the window of the stagecoach station watching the water rise in the streets with a growing terror she could not name. It was late September 1876, and she had arrived in this rough mining town only 6 hours earlier, carrying everything she owned in 2 carpet bags and a worn leather trunk that had belonged to her father. The stage driver had told her the rain would pass, that Montana storms always did, but this was no ordinary storm. The sky had turned the color of an old bruise, purple and black and angry, and the wind howled through the gaps in the wooden walls like a living thing. She pressed her hand against the cold glass, watching as men rushed past with lanterns, shouting warnings she could barely hear over the thunder. The streets were already ankle-deep in water, and it was rising fast. She had come west to work as a schoolteacher, to escape the suffocating expectations of her aunt's home in Philadelphia, to find something she could not quite name. Adventure, perhaps. Freedom. A life that belonged to her alone. She had not expected to find her death in a flood. "Miss, you need to get to higher ground." The station master appeared at her elbow, his face gray with worry. "The Grasshopper Creek is overflowing its banks. The whole lower part of town is going under." Penelope turned to him, her dark brown hair coming loose from its pins. She was 22 years old, small-framed but strong, with green eyes that her mother had always said could see right through a person's pretenses. "Where should I go?" "Up the hill, toward the mine offices. Get as high as you can." He was already moving away, gathering papers and shoving them into a satchel. "Go now, miss. Do not wait." She grabbed her bags and pushed out into the rain. The force of it nearly knocked her backward. Within seconds she was soaked through, her wool traveling dress heavy with water, her boots slipping in the mud that the street had become. The wind tore at her hat until she lost it entirely, watching it tumble away into the darkness. Other people were running too, shouting to each other, carrying children and bundles of belongings. The water was already at her calves when she started up the hill. The current pulled at her skirts, trying to drag her down. She stumbled, caught herself, kept moving. Her bags grew heavier with every step. One of them slipped from her numb fingers and was swept away before she could catch it. She cried out, reaching for it, but it was gone in an instant, swallowed by the churning brown water. The hill was steep and slick with mud. She climbed, her lungs burning, her legs shaking. Behind her, she heard a terrible cracking sound and turned to see one of the smaller buildings collapse into the flood. The water was rising faster now, impossibly fast, and she was not high enough. Not nearly high enough. Her foot slipped. She went down hard, her hands plunging into the mud, and her remaining bag was torn from her grasp by the current. She scrambled to stand, but the water was at her waist now, the current so strong she could barely keep her feet under her. She was going to die here in this rough mountain town, and no one would even know her name. Then a hand closed around her wrist. "I have got you." The voice was deep, rough with effort. "Hold on to me." She looked up into a face she had never seen before. A man, broad-shouldered and tall, his dark hair plastered to his head by the rain. He was braced against a wooden post, one arm wrapped around it, the other gripping her wrist with a strength that was the only thing keeping her from being swept away. His eyes were gray, the color of the storm itself. "I cannot hold on," she gasped. The current was too strong, pulling her legs out from under her. "Yes, you can," he pulled, hauling her closer to the post. "Grab hold, both arms." She reached for it desperately, her fingers closing around the rough wood. He wrapped one arm around her waist, anchoring her against him and the post. The water was still rising. It was at her chest now, cold enough to steal her breath. We need to get higher, he shouted over the roar of the flood. There is a building just up ahead. If we can reach it, we can get on the roof. I cannot walk in this. I will carry you. Before she could protest, he had shifted his grip, lifting her against his chest. He was strong, terribly strong, but even he struggled against the current. Each step was a battle. She wrapped her arms around his neck and held on, feeling the strain in his muscles as he fought his way forward. The building he had seen was a mining office, built of heavy logs and set back from the street on slightly higher ground. The water was only knee-deep here, but still rising. He kicked open the door and carried her inside, setting her down in the darkness. She could hear the water rushing past outside, could feel it seeping in through the gaps in the floorboards. "The roof," he said. "We have to get on the roof." There was a ladder built into the wall leading up to a storage loft. He pushed her toward it. "Climb." She climbed, her wet skirts tangling around her legs, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the rungs. He climbed behind her, close enough to catch her if she fell. The loft was small and cramped, filled with crates and barrels. He did not stop. There was a trapdoor in the ceiling, and he shoved it open, revealing the rain-lashed night above. "Go," he urged. She pulled herself up onto the roof, the wind immediately trying to tear her off. The shingles were slick and treacherous. She flattened herself against them, terrified, as he climbed up behind her. Below them, the water swirled and churned, full of debris, pieces of buildings, a dead horse, things she did not want to name. He positioned himself behind her, his back against the slight peak of the roof, and pulled her between his legs so she was sheltered against his chest. His arms came around her, holding her steady against the wind. "We will be all right," he said into her ear. "This building is solid. It will hold." "You do not know that. I am choosing to believe it." She did not even know his name. This stranger who had saved her life, who was now holding her above the floodwaters with arms that felt like iron bands. She was shaking uncontrollably from cold and fear and shock. "My name is Penelope," she said through chattering teeth. "Penelope Owens. Kane Hartley." His voice was steady, calmer than it had any right to be. "I am a ranch hand, work at the Double H about 10 miles south of here. What were you doing in town? Buying supplies, got caught in the storm." He tightened his hold on her as a gust of wind tried to tear them loose. "What about you?" "I came to teach school. I arrived this afternoon." She would have laughed at the absurdity of it if she could have stopped shaking long enough. "This is my first day here. Hell of a welcome." They fell silent, holding on to each other and the roof as the night stretched on. The rain did not stop. The water kept rising. After what felt like hours, it was lapping at the edge of the roof. Kane shifted his position, moving them higher up the slope. "If it gets much higher," she said, the words she had been trying not to think, "it will not. But if it does, then we will figure something out." His voice was firm. "I did not pull you out of that current just to let you drown now." She believed him. It was irrational, trusting this stranger so completely, but she did. He had already saved her life once. She could feel the steady beat of his heart against her back, could feel the warmth of him even through their soaked clothing. He had positioned himself to take the worst of the wind, sheltering her with his body. "Tell me about Philadelphia," he said after a while. "What? You talk like an Easterner. Tell me about where you are from. It will help pass the time." So she told him. About her parents, both dead of influenza 3 years ago. About her aunt's house, cold and proper and suffocating. About the teaching certificate she had worked so hard to earn, and the advertisement she had answered for a school teacher in Montana Territory. About her dream of standing in front of a classroom of her own, shaping young minds, making a difference in the world. His arms never loosened around her as she talked. Once, when she started shaking again, he rubbed his hands up and down her arms, trying to generate warmth through friction. It helped a little. "What about you?" she asked. "Where are you from?" "Texas, originally." "My parents had a small ranch outside San Antonio. They died when I was 15, cholera. I worked my way north after that, hiring on at different ranches. Been at the Double H for 2 years now." "Do you like it?" "Ranch work? I do. I like working with horses. I like being outside. It is hard work, but it is honest work." He paused. "I have been saving money. Want to have my own place someday. Nothing fancy. Just enough land for a small herd and a house." "That sounds nice," she said softly. The wind shifted and a fresh wave of rain hit them. She pressed back against him, seeking what little shelter he could provide. His arms tightened around her again, and she realized with a start that she felt safe. Here, on a roof in the middle of a flood, with a stranger's arms around her, she felt safer than she had in years. "Tell me more," he said. "About teaching. What made you want to do it?" She thought about that. "My mother was a teacher before she married. She used to tell me that education was the most important gift you could give someone. The ability to read, to think, to understand the world. She taught me to love books, to love learning. When she died, I wanted to honor that, to pass on what she gave me. She sounds like she was a good woman." She was. They talked through the long hours of the night, their voices low under the roar of the storm. He told her about learning to break horses, about the first time he had been thrown and the scar on his shoulder where he had landed on a rock. She told him about reading Jane Eyre by candlelight in her aunt's attic, escaping into stories when the real world felt too small. They talked about everything and nothing, the kind of conversation that happens when two people are thrown together by circumstance and have nothing to do but exist in each other's presence. Somewhere around what must have been 3 in the morning, the rain finally began to ease. The water had stopped rising about an inch below the peak of the roof where they huddled. Kane had not let go of her for even a moment, his arms a constant presence around her waist, his chest solid and warm against her back. "I think the worst is over," he said quietly. She did not want to move. Despite the cold and the wet and the terror of the night, there was something about being held like this that she did not want to give up. But dawn would come eventually, and with it would come rescue and reality and all the proper social distance that should exist between a schoolteacher and a ranch hand who were strangers to each other. "Thank you," she said, "for saving my life. You do not have to thank me." "Yes, I do. You could have saved yourself. You could have let go and climbed higher on your own. But you did not." She felt him shift behind her, felt the warmth of his breath against her ear. "I could not have lived with myself if I had done that." The sky began to lighten in the east, a pale gray that gradually turned to pink and gold. The storm clouds broke apart, revealing patches of blue. The water was still high but no longer rising, and in the growing light they could see the devastation the flood had left behind. Buildings collapsed or missing entirely. Debris scattered everywhere. But there were also signs of life. People calling to each other from rooftops and upper windows. A man in a boat, rowing slowly down what had been the main street, checking for survivors. Kane called out to him and the man rowed over. He was older, weathered, with a thick gray beard. "Anyone hurt?" "No, just cold and wet," Kane said. "Can you take the lady? I can take you both. Got room?" Kane helped Penelope down from the roof first, his hands steady on her waist as she lowered herself through the trapdoor. They climbed down to the loft, then down the ladder to the flooded first floor. The water inside the building was waist-deep and full of floating debris. Kane kept himself between her and the worst of it, guiding her to the door. The man in the boat pulled up as close as he could. Kane lifted Penelope and set her in the boat, then climbed in himself. They rowed toward higher ground where a crowd of survivors had gathered. Someone had started a fire and blankets were being distributed. A woman wrapped a blanket around Penelope's shoulders. "You poor dear. Come sit by the fire." She let herself be led to the warmth, sinking down onto a crate someone had turned into a seat. Kane was talking to some of the other men, gesturing back toward the flooded part of town. She watched him, this stranger who had held her through the night, and felt something shift in her chest. He caught her looking and came over, crouching down beside her. Up close, in the daylight, she could see that he was younger than she had thought. Maybe 25 or 26. His face was tanned and weathered from outdoor work, with a strong jaw and a mouth that looked like it smiled easily, though it was serious now. His gray eyes were kind. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Like I should be dead, but am not." "That is accurate," she laughed, surprising herself. He smiled, and she saw that she had been right. It was a good smile, warm and genuine. "I need to help with the rescue efforts," he said. "But I wanted to make sure you were all right first." "I will be fine. Go." He stood, hesitated, then crouched back down. "Where will you be staying? The boarding house is gone." "I do not know. I suppose wherever they put the other survivors." He nodded slowly. "The Double H is on high ground. Did not flood. If you need a place to stay while the town rebuilds, the owner's wife would probably welcome the company. She does not get to see many women out there." "I could not impose like that." "It would not be imposing. Mrs. Harrison is a good woman. She would be happy to help." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a scrap of paper and a stub of pencil, both miraculously still dry in their oilcloth wrapping. He wrote something down and handed it to her. "That is how to get to the ranch. If you need anything at all, you come find me. Understand?" She took the paper, their fingers brushing. Even that small contact sent a jolt through her. "I understand." He held her gaze for a long moment, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Then he stood and walked away, joining the other men who were preparing to row back into the flooded streets to search for survivors. She sat by the fire and watched him go, her hand closed tight around the scrap of paper with his directions on it. The next few days passed in a blur of chaos and recovery. 13 people had died in the flood, including the station master who had warned her to run. The lower half of Bannack was destroyed. What buildings still stood were damaged beyond immediate repair. The survivors camped on the high ground, sleeping in tents and under wagons, pooling their resources and trying to make sense of the disaster. Penelope helped where she could. She had no nursing training, but she could wrap bandages and serve food and comfort frightened children. She worked alongside the other women, all of them exhausted and grieving and determined to rebuild. She did not see Kane again, though she looked for him. Someone told her the ranch hands from the surrounding spreads had gone back to their own properties to assess the damage there and help with their own recovery efforts. She told herself it did not matter. He had been a stranger who had saved her life, nothing more. They would probably never see each other again. But at night, when she lay wrapped in borrowed blankets under a canvas tarp, she thought about the feeling of his arms around her, the steady calm of his voice, the way he had held her through the endless dark hours, never wavering, never letting go. A week after the flood, a wagon rolled into the survivor camp. A woman climbed down, plump and 50-ish with gray-streaked brown hair and a kind face. She walked straight to where Penelope was helping sort through donated clothing. "You are Miss Owens, the teacher," the woman said. It was not a question. "Yes, madam, I am Judith Harrison. My husband owns the Double H Ranch. Kane Hartley works for us." Penelope's heart gave a little jump. "Yes, I remember, he mentioned you. He said you might need a place to stay while the town rebuilds. We have a spare room, and I would be pleased to have another woman around the place. Lord knows I get tired of cooking for a bunch of men with no one to talk to but my husband." Judith smiled. What do you say? Penelope looked around the camp. The schoolhouse was gone, washed away in the flood. There would be no teaching position until the town rebuilt, which could take months. She had no money, no belongings except what had been donated to her, and no prospects. I do not want to be a burden, she said carefully. You would not be. I could use help around the house if you are willing to work. Nothing too strenuous, just cooking and cleaning and such. I would provide room and board and a small wage besides. It was more than generous. It was a lifeline. When would you want me to start? Right now, if you are ready. I have the wagon. So Penelope gathered her few belongings and climbed into the wagon beside Judith Harrison, and they drove south out of the ruined town toward the Double H Ranch. The ranch was beautiful in a stark, wild way. Rolling grassland stretched in every direction, dotted with grazing cattle. The main house was built of logs, large and solid, with a wide porch and glass windows. Behind it stood a barn, a bunkhouse, and several other outbuildings. Mountains rose blue and distant on the horizon. Judith showed her to a small room on the second floor of the house. It had a real bed with clean sheets, a dresser, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the prairie. After a week of sleeping on the ground, it felt like unimaginable luxury. Supper is at 6, Judith said. The men eat in the bunkhouse usually, but my husband and I take our meals in the dining room. You are welcome to join us or eat in your room if you prefer. I will join you, thank you, Judith smiled. Good. It will be nice to have someone to talk to besides Thomas. He is a dear man, but not much for conversation. That evening, Penelope washed as best she could with the basin and pitcher of water Judith had provided, and changed into the one dress she had been given that actually fit reasonably well. It was plain brown calico, worn but clean. She braided her hair and pinned it up, then went downstairs to the dining room. Thomas Harrison was a tall, lean man in his late 50s with a deeply tanned face and laugh lines around his eyes. He stood when she entered and shook her hand with a firm grip. Pleased to meet you, Miss Owens. Judith tells me you survived the flood. Terrible business that. Glad you made it through. Thanks to one of your ranch hands, Penelope said. Kane Hartley. He saved my life. Thomas nodded. Kane is a good man. Best hand I've got. You were lucky he was there. They sat down to supper, which was hearty and plentiful. Roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, green beans from Judith's garden. Penelope ate more than she had in days, suddenly ravenous. The men will be coming in from the range tomorrow, Thomas said. Been out checking the herd, making sure we did not lose too many head in the storm. I expect Kane will be glad to know you are here. Penelope felt her cheeks warm. I am sure he was just being kind. Judith and Thomas exchanged a look that Penelope could not quite interpret. After supper, she helped Judith clean up the kitchen, then retreated to her room. She stood at the window, looking out over the darkening prairie, and wondered if Kane was out there somewhere under the same stars. The next day, she threw herself into helping Judith with the household work. There was plenty to do. Laundry for a house full of men, cooking, cleaning, mending. Judith was a patient teacher, showing her how to make bread and pie crust, how to get stains out of work shirts, how to organize a pantry efficiently. The work was hard but satisfying in a way Penelope had not expected. There was something deeply grounding about it, something that connected her to the reality of survival in this wild place. She was in the kitchen kneading bread dough when she heard the sound of horses outside. Voices called out greetings. Judith wiped her hands on her apron and smiled. The boys are back. I had better start on supper. We will need to feed a crowd tonight. Penelope's hands stilled in the dough. Kane was back. She would see him again. Her heart was beating too fast. Go on and say hello, Judith said gently. The bread can wait. I should not. Why not? He saved your life. It would be rude not to thank him properly. Penelope washed the dough off her hands and removed her apron with trembling fingers. She walked to the front door and out onto the porch. There were 6 men dismounting from their horses in front of the barn. She recognized Kane immediately, even with his back to her. Something about the way he moved, the set of his shoulders. He was laughing at something one of the other men had said, and the sound of it made her smile. Then he turned and saw her standing on the porch. He went very still. For a long moment they just looked at each other across the yard. Then he was walking toward her, his stride long and purposeful. He climbed the porch steps and stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "You came," he said. "Mrs. Harrison was kind enough to offer me work. I am glad." His voice was low, rough with some emotion she could not name. "I was worried about you. Wanted to come check on you, but we had to take care of the herd. I understand. That had to come first, did it?" He was looking at her intently, those gray eyes searching her face. "I am not so sure," her breath caught. Before she could respond, one of the other ranch hands called out, "Kane, you going to introduce us to the lady or just stand there staring?" Kane's jaw tightened, but he turned. "Miss Owens, these are the men I work with. That loud one is Jake. The others are Sam, Charlie, Dutch, and Pete." They all removed their hats and nodded respectfully. Jake, who was young and freckled, gave her a friendly grin. "Pleased to meet you, miss. Kane told us all about the flood, said you were the bravest woman he ever met." "I was terrified," Penelope said honestly. "That is what brave means," Kane said quietly. "Being scared and doing it anyway." She looked at him and something passed between them. Something warm and electric and impossible to ignore. Judith appeared in the doorway. "Supper will be ready in 2 hours. You boys get washed up." The men dispersed toward the bunkhouse. Kane lingered on the porch, turning his hat in his hands. "Will you eat with us tonight?" Penelope asked. "In the house, I mean. I am sure the Harrisons would not mind." "That would not be proper. The hands eat in the bunkhouse." "Nothing about our acquaintance has been proper so far," he laughed, a surprised sound. "That is true enough. Please?" She did not know why it mattered so much, only that it did. He studied her face, then nodded. "All right, I will ask Mrs. Harrison if it is acceptable." Judith, of course, was delighted to set an extra place at the table. That evening, Kane sat across from Penelope in the dining room, freshly washed and wearing a clean shirt, and they talked over roast chicken and potatoes as if they had known each other for years instead of days. He told stories about the cattle drive, about finding a newborn calf separated from its mother and carrying it back to the herd on his saddle, about the grizzly bear they had spotted from a distance, huge and magnificent, about sleeping under the stars and waking up covered in frost. She told him about learning to make bread, about the disaster her first loaf had been, dense as a brick, about helping Judith put up preserves and nearly burning the jam, about the books she had found in the Harrisons' small library and how hungry she was to read them all. Thomas and Judith watched them with knowing smiles, occasionally contributing to the conversation but mostly letting the 2 young people talk. After supper, Kane walked Penelope out onto the porch. The sun was setting in a blaze of orange and gold, painting the prairie in shades of fire. They stood side by side at the railing, not quite touching but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "I want to court you properly," Kane said without preamble. "If you would allow it." Her heart stuttered. "We barely know each other. I know that I held you all night while you told me your dreams. I know that you are brave and kind and determined. I know that when I look at you, I feel something I have never felt before." He turned to face her fully. "I do not have much to offer. I am a ranch hand with a little bit of money saved. But I am a hard worker and I am honest, and I would never do anything to hurt you. If you would give me a chance, I would like to see if this could be something." She looked up at him, at this man who had saved her life and held her through the darkness and now stood before her asking for permission to court her. It was too fast, too sudden. They were strangers, really, but she had felt safer in his arms during the flood than she had felt anywhere in years. And when she talked to him, it felt like coming home. "Yes," she said softly, "I would like that." His smile could have lit up the whole prairie. "Yeah, yeah." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. His palm was calloused from hard work, his grip warm and strong. "Can I come see you tomorrow evening, after I finish my work? I would like that very much." They stood there holding hands and watching the sunset, and Penelope felt something unfold inside her chest. Something light and warm and terrifying in its intensity. Over the next weeks, Kane came to the house every evening after his work was done. They would sit on the porch or walk down to the creek that ran through the property, always in full view of the house because propriety still mattered, even here. They talked about everything: their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. He told her about growing up in Texas, about his mother's singing voice and his father's laugh, about the devastation of losing them and the loneliness of the years that followed. She told him about her parents' love story, about how her father had courted her mother with books of poetry, about the way they used to dance in the kitchen when they thought no one was watching. Kane brought her small gifts: a smooth stone from the creek bed that was almost perfectly round, a feather from a hawk, wildflowers that he had picked on his way back from the range. She pressed the flowers between the pages of books and kept the stone and feather on her dresser where she could see them every morning. He was unfailingly respectful, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. But there was a tension building between them, an awareness that grew stronger every time they were together. The brush of his hand against hers, the way his eyes lingered on her face. The increasing difficulty of saying goodnight and walking away from each other. October gave way to November. The air turned crisp and cold, and snow began to dust the mountains. The town of Bannack was slowly rebuilding, but the schoolhouse would not be ready until spring at the earliest. Penelope did not mind. She was happy here, helping Judith and spending her evenings with Kane. One Sunday, he asked if she would like to go riding with him. Judith helped her borrow a split skirt and a warm coat, and Kane saddled up 2 horses. They rode out across the prairie, the sky huge and blue above them. He showed her the boundaries of the ranch, the winter pastures where the cattle would be moved soon. They rode up into the foothills, and he pointed out where he wanted to have his own place someday. A sheltered valley with good grass and a stream running through it. "I could build a house there," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Nothing fancy, but solid, a place to raise a family." She looked at the valley, imagining it, a log cabin with a stone fireplace, a garden, children playing in the grass. "It is beautiful. Would you want something like that?" He was watching her carefully. "Or do you need to be in town, close to the school?" She understood what he was really asking. "I became a teacher because I wanted to do something meaningful with my life." But there are different kinds of meaningful. Teaching children is important, but so is building a home, making a life with someone, raising a family. She met his eyes. "I think I could be happy in a valley like this if I was with the right person." His whole face lit up. "Penelope." "Kane." He dismounted and came to help her down from her horse. His hands lingered on her waist after her feet touched the ground. They stood very close, his face inches from hers. "I am going to kiss you now," he said softly. "If that is all right." That would be more than all right. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her gently, sweetly, his lips warm against hers. It was her first kiss, and it was perfect. When he pulled back, she was breathless. "I am falling in love with you," he said. "I think I have been since that night on the roof." "I am falling in love with you too." He kissed her again, less gently this time, his arms coming around her and pulling her close. She melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt, and let herself feel everything she had been holding back. The want, the need, the bone-deep certainty that this man was meant to be hers. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. He rested his forehead against hers. "I should ask you properly." "Ask me what, Penelope Owens? Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" She felt tears spring to her eyes. "Yes, yes, absolutely yes." He let out a whoop of joy and lifted her off her feet, spinning her around. She laughed, clutching his shoulders, dizzy with happiness. "When?" he asked, setting her down. "I do not want to wait long, neither do I. But we should be sensible. You need to save more money, and I should help you. We could get married in the spring." "Spring," he repeated. "That seems like a lifetime away. It will go faster than you think." He kissed her again, slow and deep, and she thought maybe spring was too far away after all. They rode back to the ranch hand in hand, their horses walking close together. When they arrived, they told the Harrisons the news. Judith cried happy tears and hugged them both. Thomas shook Kane's hand and told him he was getting a fine woman. That evening, all the ranch hands celebrated with them, and Jake played fiddle while they danced in the barn. Kane held Penelope close as they swayed to the music, and she rested her head against his chest and listened to his heartbeat. The same heartbeat she had listened to all night during the flood. The heartbeat that had become as familiar to her as her own. Winter settled in over Montana, harsh and beautiful. The ranch work continued, harder now in the cold and snow. Kane still came to see Penelope every evening, though sometimes only for a few minutes if the weather was bad or the work had run late. Those brief visits sustained them both. They made plans. Kane showed her his savings, a leather pouch full of carefully hoarded coins and bills. It was more than she had expected. Combined with what she had earned working for Judith, and what she would continue to earn through the winter, they would have enough to file a land claim on the valley he had shown her and start building in the spring. Christmas came, and Penelope gave Kane a shirt she had sewn for him, each stitch made with love. He gave her a small gold locket that had belonged to his mother. Inside was a tiny photograph of him, serious-faced in his Sunday best. "So you can keep me close to your heart," he said as he fastened it around her neck. "You are already there," she told him. In January, he started spending his Sundays working on plans for their house. He was surprisingly good at drawing, his rough hands producing careful sketches of rooms and dimensions. Penelope sat beside him and made suggestions, and together they designed their future home. It would have a large kitchen with windows facing east to catch the morning sun. A sitting room with a fireplace big enough to heat the whole house. 2 bedrooms to start, with room to add more later. A wide porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset. "I want our children to grow up here," Kane said one evening, his hand covering hers on the sketches. "I want them to run wild like I did, to know the land and respect it, to have the freedom I had." "How many children do you want?" she asked. "As many as you are willing to give me. 4, maybe 5, she laughed. "That is a lot of children. We do not have to have that many. However many we are blessed with will be enough." She squeezed his hand. "I think 4 or 5 sounds perfect." February brought a series of blizzards that kept everyone close to the buildings for days at a time. Penelope worked alongside Judith, cooking massive meals for the ranch hands who were trapped in the bunkhouse, unable to get to the range. Kane came to the main house during the worst of it, and he and the other men helped with the heavy work, chopping wood and digging paths through the snow. One evening, when the snow was falling so thick they could barely see the barn from the house, Kane and Penelope sat together in the parlor. The Harrisons had discreetly retired early, leaving them alone with instructions to keep the fire going. They sat on the settee, close but not quite improper, and watched the flames dance. "I have been thinking," Kane said slowly, "about the wedding." "What about it?" "I want to marry you as soon as possible. I hate leaving you every night. I hate sleeping in the bunkhouse when I could be with you." He took her hand. "I know we plan to wait until spring, until the house is built. But what if we did not wait? What if we got married sooner?" Her heart raced. "Where would we live?" "We could stay here in the main house if the Harrisons would allow it. Just until the weather clears enough to start building. Then we could move into a tent on our land while we work on the house. It would not be comfortable, but we would be together." She thought about it, about being his wife, truly his in every way. About not having to say good night and watch him walk away. About falling asleep in his arms every night the way she had that first night during the flood. "Let me talk to Judith," she said. Judith, of course, was thrilled at the idea. "You should get married as soon as possible," she said. "Life is too short to wait for perfect circumstances, and Lord knows you two are in love. Anyone can see it." So they set a date, March 15th. Early enough that they were not waiting forever, late enough that they could make basic preparations. There would be a simple ceremony at the ranch, performed by a circuit preacher who came through the area once a month. Judith would make a cake, and they would have a dance afterward. Penelope wrote to her aunt in Philadelphia, informing her of the engagement. The response that came back was frosty with disapproval. A ranch hand. A nobody. Penelope was throwing away her education, her prospects, her chance at a good life. But Penelope did not care. She knew what she wanted, and it was not her aunt's version of a good life. As March approached, the weather began to improve. The snow melted, revealing brown grass and muddy earth. The creek swelled with runoff, and Kane began spending every spare moment preparing for the wedding. He fashioned a simple gold band from a coin, hammering it carefully until it was perfectly round and smooth. He bought fabric in town and asked Judith to help him make a new dress for Penelope, something special for the wedding day. He cleaned and polished his best boots until they shone. Penelope sewed her own wedding dress with Judith's help, using white cotton and the last of the lace her mother had left her. It was simple but beautiful, with long sleeves and a high collar and tiny pearl buttons down the back. She made a wreath of dried wildflowers for her hair. The night before the wedding, Kane came to the house to say good night. They stood on the porch, holding hands, both of them too excited to think about sleep. "Are you nervous?" he asked. "A little." "Are you?" "Terrified," she laughed. "Why?" "Because I want to be a good husband to you. I want to give you everything you deserve, and I am afraid I will fail." She reached up and touched his face. "You could never fail me, Kane Hartley. You saved my life. You showed me what it means to be loved. You are everything I never knew I needed." He pulled her into his arms and held her tight. "I love you so much. I love you too." They stood there holding each other as the stars came out above them, and Penelope thought about how far she had come from that terrified woman clinging to a post in the flood. She had lost everything that night. Her belongings, her plans, her sense of safety, but she had found something infinitely more valuable. She had found Kane. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, the sky a brilliant blue. Penelope woke early, her stomach full of butterflies. Judith helped her dress, fastening the tiny buttons and arranging the flower wreath in her hair. "You look beautiful," Judith said, her eyes misty. "Kane is a lucky man. I am the lucky one." The ceremony was held outside in front of the main house. All the ranch hands were there, scrubbed clean and wearing their best clothes. A few neighbors had ridden over to witness the wedding. Thomas stood beside Kane as his best man. Judith stood beside Penelope. The circuit preacher was an old man with a white beard and kind eyes. He smiled at them as they stood before him, holding hands. "Dearly beloved," he began. Penelope barely heard the words. She was too focused on Kane, on the look in his eyes as he gazed at her. Love and joy and wonder, all mixed together. When it came time to say their vows, his voice was steady and strong. "I, Kane Hartley, take you, Penelope Owens, to be my lawfully wedded wife. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part." She repeated the words back to him, her voice thick with emotion. He slid the gold band onto her finger, and she marveled at how perfectly it fit. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Kane, you may kiss your bride." He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her softly, sweetly, and everyone cheered. When they broke apart, they were both grinning like fools. The celebration that followed was joyful and raucous. Judith had outdone herself with the food. There was roast beef and ham, fresh bread, potatoes, 3 kinds of pie, and a beautiful white cake with buttercream frosting. Jake and another ranch hand played music, and everyone danced until their feet hurt. Kane and Penelope danced together for hours, unable to stop smiling, unable to believe they were really married. As the sun began to set, Thomas clapped Kane on the shoulder and told them to go. They had been given a room in the main house for their wedding night, separate from the guest room where Penelope had been staying. They walked to the house hand in hand, suddenly shy with each other. Inside their room, Kane closed the door and turned to her. The last rays of sunlight streamed through the window, turning everything golden. "Hello, wife," he said softly. "Hello, husband." He crossed to her and began unfastening the tiny buttons down the back of her dress, his fingers gentle. She stood very still, her heart racing. When the dress fell away, she stepped out of it, standing before him in just her chemise and stockings. He looked at her like she was something precious, something to be treasured. "You are so beautiful." She reached up and began unbuttoning his shirt, her hands trembling slightly. "So are you." They came together slowly, tenderly, learning each other's bodies with careful hands and soft kisses. He was patient with her inexperience, murmuring words of love and reassurance. When they finally joined together, she gasped at the sensation, and he held very still, giving her time to adjust. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice strained with the effort of holding back. "Yes, do not stop." They moved together, finding a rhythm as natural as breathing. And when they tumbled over the edge together, clinging to each other, Penelope thought that this was what she had been searching for all along. Not adventure or freedom or independence, but this: connection, belonging, love. Afterward they lay tangled together, her head on his chest, his arms around her. She could hear his heartbeat, steady and strong, and she smiled. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his fingers trailing up and down her spine. "That I am glad the flood happened." He stiffened. "That is a terrible thing to say. People died." "I know. And that is tragic. But if it had not happened, I never would have met you. You never would have held me through the night. We would have passed each other on the street and never known what we could have been." He was quiet for a long moment. "I suppose that is true. I am glad you are here with me now, whatever it took to get us here." "Me too." They made love again, slower this time, savoring every touch and kiss, and then they slept, wrapped in each other's arms as husband and wife. Over the next weeks, they continued to live at the main house while planning their move to their own land. Kane worked with Thomas to arrange his schedule so he could spend time building their cabin. Several of the other ranch hands volunteered to help on their days off, and the house began to take shape in the valley Kane had shown her. Penelope rode out with him whenever she could, bringing lunch and watching as the walls went up. It was hard work, back-breaking work, but Kane never complained. He worked from dawn until dark, his hands bleeding from splinters and rough wood, his muscles aching. But every evening when he came home to her, he smiled like he had won the greatest prize in the world. In late April, the house was finished enough for them to move in. It was rough and unfinished inside, but it had a roof and walls and a working fireplace. They loaded their few belongings into a wagon and drove out to their new home. Penelope stood in the empty main room and looked around. Raw wood floors, walls that still needed to be chinked and plastered. Windows without curtains, but it was theirs. Kane came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "What do you think?" "I think it is perfect." They spent their first night in the new house lying on a pallet of blankets in front of the fireplace, making love by flickering light and then sleeping deeply, exhausted and happy. The spring and summer passed in a blur of work. They planted a garden, and Penelope learned to coax vegetables from the stubborn Montana soil. They built furniture, simple pieces that were functional if not beautiful. Kane built a chicken coop and bought half a dozen hens. Penelope learned to milk the cow they purchased from a neighbor. It was hard work, harder than anything Penelope had ever done. Her hands blistered and calloused, her back ached. She fell into bed exhausted every night, but she had never been happier. Kane worked for Thomas during the day, earning the wages they still needed, and spent his evenings improving their home. He built a real bed frame, a table and chairs, shelves for Penelope's books. He chinked the walls and installed proper doors. Bit by bit, the house became a home. In July, Penelope realized she had missed her monthly courses. She waited another month to be sure, then told Kane one evening as they sat on their new porch watching the sunset, "I think I am with child." He went very still. "Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be without seeing a doctor." He turned to her, his eyes shining. "We are having a baby. We are having a baby." He let out a whoop and swept her into his arms, spinning her around until she was dizzy. "We are having a baby," she laughed, clutching his shoulders. "Put me down before you drop me." He set her down gently, then dropped to his knees and pressed his face against her still flat stomach. "Hello, little one. I am your papa. I already love you so much." Tears streamed down Penelope's face. She ran her fingers through his dark hair and felt so full of love she thought she might burst. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Penelope tired easily and had bouts of morning sickness, but nothing too severe. Kane was endlessly attentive, always making sure she had enough to eat, that she was not working too hard. He built a cradle from smooth, sanded pine and carved their initials into the headboard along with the date. Judith helped Penelope sew baby clothes and quilts. In March of 1877, exactly 1 year after their wedding, Penelope went into labor. Judith and the midwife from town attended her, while Kane paced outside the bedroom door, wearing a path in the floor. It was a long labor, lasting through the night and into the next day. Kane could hear Penelope crying out in pain, and it took everything in him not to burst through the door. Finally, as the sun was setting, he heard a new sound. A thin, warbling cry. The most beautiful sound he had ever heard. Judith opened the door, her face tired but smiling. "You have a son." He pushed past her into the room. Penelope was propped up against the pillows, sweaty and exhausted but radiant. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in a blue blanket. Kane crossed to the bed and sank down beside her, staring at the impossibly small face of his son. "He is perfect," he whispered. "He has your eyes," Penelope said. "Look." The baby blinked up at him with unfocused gray eyes, and Kane felt his heart crack open. "Hello, little man. I am your papa." "What should we name him?" Penelope asked. They had discussed names but had not settled on anything. Kane looked at his son, at his wife, at the life they had built together. "What about James, after my father, James Hartley?" Penelope smiled. "I like it. James Kane Hartley." "James Kane Hartley," Kane repeated. He reached out a finger, and his son's tiny hand closed around it with surprising strength. "Welcome to the world, James." Fatherhood changed Kane in ways he had not expected. He had always worked hard, but now he worked even harder, driven by the need to provide for his family. He expanded their herd, buying more cattle with his savings. He built an addition onto the house, giving them more room. He planted more crops. Penelope blossomed into motherhood. She was patient and loving with James, singing to him and reading to him even though he was too young to understand the words. She taught him to clap his hands and wave goodbye. When he took his first stumbling steps, she cried with pride. As James grew, Penelope found herself thinking about teaching again. There were other families in the area now, homesteaders and ranchers with children who needed education. She talked to Kane about it one evening after James had been put to bed. "What if I started a small school here? Just a few hours a week for the children nearby. I could teach them reading and arithmetic, basic things." "You want to do that while taking care of James and the house?" Kane asked. "I think I could manage both, and I miss teaching. I miss feeling like I am contributing something beyond our family." "You are contributing. You are raising our son. You are making our house a home. That is more than enough. I know, but I want to do more." He studied her face, then nodded. "All right. If it is what you want, then we will make it work. I can help with James when I am home, and maybe we can pay one of the neighbor girls to come help with the housework a few days a week." So Penelope started a small school, teaching 8 children from the surrounding ranches 3 mornings a week in their sitting room. It was not the schoolhouse in Bannack she had dreamed of, but it was hers, and it was meaningful. The children were eager to learn, and she loved watching their faces light up as they mastered new concepts. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Kane worked the ranch with Thomas and slowly built up their own herd. Penelope taught her little school and raised James. They made love frequently, their passion for each other never dimming. On summer evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch James play in the grass, catching grasshoppers and laughing at his own discoveries. In the fall of 1878, Penelope realized she was pregnant again. This time she knew the signs immediately. She told Kane as they lay in bed one night, his hand resting on her stomach. "Again," he said, delight clear in his voice. "Again." He kissed her slow and deep. "I love you so much. I love you too. This pregnancy was harder than the first." Penelope was more tired, more sick, but she pushed through, determined not to let it slow her down. Kane worried constantly, always trying to get her to rest more, to do less. They argued about it occasionally, but never for long. They could not stay angry at each other. In May of 1879, Penelope gave birth to their second son. They named him Thomas Jacob, after both Thomas Harrison and Kane's maternal grandfather. He was bigger than James had been, with a shock of dark hair and lungs that could wake the dead. James, now 2 years old, was fascinated by his baby brother, always wanting to hold him and help take care of him. Life was chaotic with 2 small children, but it was also full of joy. Kane would come home from work to find Penelope covered in flour from baking, James helping her stir the batter with more enthusiasm than skill. Baby Thomas propped in a basket nearby. He would kiss his wife, ruffle his oldest son's hair and pick up the baby, and think that he was the luckiest man alive. The years passed quickly. James started helping with small chores around the ranch. Thomas learned to walk and talk, always trying to keep up with his older brother. Penelope's little school grew, and she hired a young woman to help teach the older children while she focused on the younger ones. In 1881, Penelope gave birth to their first daughter. They named her Clara Rose, and she was the image of her mother, with the same green eyes and delicate features. Kane held her and cried, overwhelmed by love for this tiny girl. 2 years later, another daughter arrived. They named her Mary Elizabeth, and she had Kane's gray eyes and Penelope's stubborn streak. With 4 children under the age of 6, the house was always full of noise and laughter and the occasional tears. Through it all, Kane and Penelope's love for each other never wavered. They still found time to be alone, to talk and laugh and make love. They still held hands when they walked. They still looked at each other across a crowded room and smiled secret smiles. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Kane gave Penelope a portrait that had been painted by a traveling artist. It showed the 2 of them and their 4 children standing in front of their house. Penelope cried when she saw it. "So we will always remember," Kane said. "How lucky we are, how far we have come." She kissed him. "I remember every day." That night, after the children were asleep, they sat on the porch as they had done countless times before. The valley spread out before them, peaceful in the moonlight. Their land, their home, their life. "You ever think about that night?" Kane asked. "The flood?" "Sometimes. Do you?" "All the time. I think about how easily we could have missed each other if I had taken shelter somewhere else. If you had not been standing in that spot when the water rose, we were so close to never meeting at all. But we did meet, and you held me all night, even though you did not know me, even though you had no reason to." "I had every reason to." He took her hand. "I felt it even then. That you were important, that I needed to keep you safe." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You did, you still do, always." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out. After a while, Kane spoke again. "I want to grow old with you, Penelope. I want to see our children grow up and have children of their own. I want to sit on this porch when we are 80 and hold your hand and remember all the years we had together." "We will," she said. "We have so much life ahead of us still." And they did. The years continued to pass, bringing new challenges and new joys. James grew into a fine young man who loved working with horses just like his father. Thomas was quieter, more studious, and helped Penelope with the school. Clara was spirited and adventurous, always climbing trees and exploring the hills. Mary was the peacemaker, the one who smoothed over arguments and made everyone feel loved. In 1887, Penelope gave birth to their 5th and final child, a boy they named David. He was a surprise, arriving when Penelope was 43 and thought her childbearing years were over. But he was healthy and happy, and he completed their family. Kane and Penelope watched their children grow with pride and joy. They saw James marry a rancher's daughter and start his own spread nearby. They saw Thomas go to college in the East and come back with a law degree to practice in Bannack. They saw Clara marry a doctor and move to Helena. They saw Mary marry a man who worked for the railroad and settle in Butte. And they raised David, their youngest, with the wisdom that comes from years of experience. Through it all, their love remained constant. They still made each other laugh. They still reached for each other in the night. They still looked at each other and saw the person they had fallen in love with all those years ago during the flood. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party. The house was full of people, full of laughter and music and celebration. Kane pulled Penelope onto the floor for a dance, and they swayed together as they had done at their wedding. 25 years, she said. "Can you believe it? Not a day has felt long enough with you." She smiled up at him. Still the charmer, still in love. They kissed, and their children cheered, and Kane thought about the night he had held a terrified stranger above the floodwaters. How he had known, even then, that she was meant to be his. How the hardest night of his life had led to the greatest blessing he could have imagined. As they grew older, they slowed down but never stopped. They still worked their land, though they hired help for the heavy labor. They still welcomed their children and grandchildren for visits. They still sat on the porch every evening and watched the sunset over their valley. When Kane turned 60, his hair was more gray than dark, and his hands were gnarled with arthritis from years of hard work. But he was still strong, still vital, still the man Penelope had fallen in love with. And she was still beautiful to him, even with silver in her hair and lines around her eyes. To him, she was still the young woman he had held through the darkness, still the bride who had smiled at him on their wedding day. On a warm evening in June of 1906, they sat on the porch as they had done thousands of times before. Their youngest son David was visiting with his new wife, and the sound of their laughter drifted out from inside the house. Kane held Penelope's hand, his thumb rubbing circles on her palm. "I have been thinking about that night again," he said. "The flood. Why? Because I want you to know that I would do it all again. Every hard moment, every struggle, every worry. I would live through that flood 1,000 times if it meant getting to spend my life with you." Tears filled her eyes. "Kane Hartley, you still know how to make me cry. Good tears, I hope, the best tears." She squeezed his hand. "You saved my life that night, but you did more than that. You gave me a life worth living. You gave me love and family and a home. You gave me everything I did not even know I needed." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "You gave me just as much. You made me believe in love. You made me want to be a better man. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." They sat together as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple. And they knew, both of them, that they had been blessed beyond measure. That the flood that had brought them together had been a gift, terrible and devastating but ultimately transformative. They had built a good life together. They had raised fine children. They had loved each other through every joy and every sorrow. And they would continue to love each other for whatever years they had left. As darkness fell and the stars came out, Kane stood and offered Penelope his hand. "Come to bed, wife." She took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. "Coming, husband." They walked inside together, still holding hands after 30 years of marriage. And in the morning, they would wake up together as they had done every morning since that spring day when they had promised to love each other until death parted them. Their story had started with a flood, with terror and desperation, and a stranger's strong arms holding her above the water. But it had become so much more than that. It had become a love story for the ages, a testament to the power of chance encounters and brave choices and hearts that were open to the possibility of love. Kane Hartley had held Penelope Owens above the water all night during that terrible flood in 1876. And by the spring of 1877, he had married her. But their story did not end there. It continued for decades, through the building of a home and the raising of a family and the creation of a legacy that would outlive them both. They had grandchildren who played in the valley where they had built their house. They had great-grandchildren who heard the story of how their great-grandparents had met. And every time the story was told, it ended the same way. With two people who had been strangers but became everything to each other. With a love that had been born in darkness and disaster, but had grown into something beautiful and enduring. When Kane passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, Penelope held his hand and whispered all the words of love she had said to him over the decades of their marriage. And when she joined him 6 months later, unable to bear life without the man who had been her partner, her lover, her best friend, Their children buried them side by side in the valley they had loved. The headstone reads simply, Kane and Penelope Hartley, beloved parents and grandparents, together forever. And in that valley in Montana, their house still stood, occupied now by their grandson who worked the land they had claimed. The porch where they had spent so many evenings was still there, weathered but solid. And sometimes, on quiet nights, you could almost hear the echo of their laughter, the whisper of their love story that had started with a flood and ended only when death parted them at last. They had been strangers who met during a flood. He had held her above the water all night, and he had married her by spring. But more than that, he had loved her for a lifetime, and she had loved him just as fiercely in return. And that, in the end, was the truest thing of all.